Welcome to the Neurodiverse Love podcast. I'm Mona, and I was married for 30 years, in that relationship for 32, and we didn't find out until our 29th year of marriage that we were a neurodiverse couple. And I've been divorced since 2018, and together we have an amazing adult daughter who's actually going to be turning 26 next month, and she's doing fantastic and thriving. So today I have another AANE certified therapist joining us on the podcast, and her name is Barbara Grant. And Barbara, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mona. I'm so happy to be here with you. Love what you're doing with this podcast.
Thank you so much. It really is my passion, and it is a labor of love, and I'm happy to deliver it every week. It's so much fun meeting new people. So thank you. I always love to start the podcast by having my guests share a little bit about why and how they got involved working with neurodiverse couples. And then I'd love to also hear what made you move forward on getting the AANE certification.
Awesome. Well, happy to share that. So I was raised in a family that actually had neurodiversity in it, in more generational and extended family. And I think even growing up, I had a lot of people in my life that were on the spectrum and neurodiverse, and I was able to somehow connect with these people. I ended up marrying. My first marriage was to somebody who we found out after the marriage was over, he was neurodiverse. And we were married 20 years, and we have two beautiful children. When the marriage ended, I remarried. And after that, I had a strong and very clear suspicion that my son was likely neurodiverse and, having some challenges and transitions in his life. And I was able to have him assessed, and certainly it came through okay. He was definitely on the spectrum. And when we realized he was on the spectrum, that's when we realized his father, my first husband, had been on the spectrum, which was a big piece of information falling into place and put so many things into perspective. The good news is that my first husband and I are best friends, and his new wife and I are best friends. We walked our daughter down the aisle at her wedding last year, and we're really family. So, there's no hard feelings. We've always pulled together to be the best parents we can be. And he's grown so much as a person, and we've grown so much as people. It's just growth all around. So I want to share that up front.
That is awesome. And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of folks don't get there easily. And, I run two support groups for the non-autistic neurotypical partners, and I do see a lot of hurt when folks are in the process of separating or divorce. So that'll give some folks hope. So thank you for that.
Anything is possible. Well, with God, everything is possible. It did take God a little bit of work on both of us to get us there, but
I'm sure.
So with beginning with my son, I began to educate myself more about what neurodiversity was. And as I began to recognize it more in, oh my gosh, it was in my family, and this person when I was growing up was on the spectrum likely. And I began to see it in more places and more people I knew. And I began to suspect it was much more prevalent. So I was also doing some spiritual counseling through my church, and I'm being a trained spiritual counselor, supporting others and mentoring others on levels. And I saw that there was definitely relationships that I was encountering where I was thinking, wow, I wonder if neurodiversity is at work here. This sounds a lot like what I experienced. In time, I ended up, I'm almost done with my master's in marriage family therapy. And in the process of getting trained to be a more competent coach for neurodiversity, I learned about the AANE certification program and was thrilled to participate in that. And it was, again, a tremendous leg up in practical understanding of how to help people, what the differences in neurology can do in a relationship. And Grace Myhill is a great resource in the industry. So anyone who has any interest in that, I highly recommend that being worth their while. There isn't much out there. There are more and more resources coming up about it, but there's not very much about neurodiverse couples work. And I'm almost finished with my master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and it hasn't been mentioned yet that there is such a thing as neurodiversity. The universities and training for counseling and therapy don't talk about it. They probably don't know about it. And so it's really a grassroots in the field kind of thing. Many people like you and I who have had that in our lives are finding, wow, there are other people like me who are in this situation, and there's nobody to help them. And what can I do to help was my big reason for getting involved with all of this.
I love it, Barbara. And you're speaking my language, because after I took time to heal, which was a solid 2 years, I decided, in the middle of the pandemic, to talk to my friend who had turned me on to the idea of my ex and I being neurologically different, and said, "You want to start a podcast?" And she said, "Yeah." And now there's almost, 40,000, well, actually 50,000 plays of the podcast from all over the world.
Yeah.
So that just says to me that there are folks out there who are looking for this resource, who are looking for information. And I'm so glad there's more now, because the first person I talked to was Grace Myhill too, 5 years ago in 2017, when I found out we were a neurodiverse couple. And thank goodness that she was available, because I joined her support group and I realized I wasn't alone. So thank you so much for sharing about your personal story and why you're doing this work. And I know, there's so many folks that once they find out that they're in a neurodiverse relationship, there's a lot that they have to understand, and there's a lot of change that is going to go on. And in order for them to be successful as a couple and, thrive as individuals. So I know one of the things that you help educate couples about and really understand are the stages of change. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take us through those stages and talk a little bit maybe about what a neurodiverse couple might be experiencing.
Absolutely. So the 5 stages of change model came out of the addiction therapeutic world, actually initially for nicotine and cigarette smoking. And then, of course, it was embraced by therapists who are addiction specialists for alcohol, drugs, all kinds of things. And the idea but the idea is that change is a universal process, and that everyone comes to change for different reasons at different times, but they generally move through these 5 stages. And it's very helpful when you're giving somebody coaching or you're a therapist counseling somebody. It's really helpful to know, what stage are these people in? Like, are they even candidates for change, right? So the first stage is called pre-contemplation. And that's the stage where people are completely clueless, unaware, or in denial that there's anything they need to change. They don't see the problem. Maybe, they've heard that there might be a problem. They discount it. They're completely disinterested in doing any of the work of change. And life is working well enough for them as they are, I guess. So that's called pre-contemplation. Then the next stage is contemplation. And at this point, they've left pre-contemplation and begun to think, well, maybe, why do people keep telling me that this is wrong about me? Or what else, what am I not seeing? Or maybe there is something I can improve. But they're not yet committed to doing any of the work. And they really haven't processed what it would take to do the work, but they're now at least considering it. All right. So this is called contemplation. The next stage is called preparation. And in this stage is a key changeover stage where they now think, okay, I think I need to change. What would that mean for me? Do I have to apply myself? What do I have to stop doing? What is this going to cost me? What would happen if I don't change? And they really start to wrestle conceptually with the idea of change, but yet they're not yet changing. They're just
Mhm.
really teeing up to think about doing that,
Right, right, right.
right?
It's
But they're
in their
getting
head. It's in
yeah,
their
they're
head.
getting their, maybe talking to a therapist or a coach or, beginning to think about it, maybe read a little bit. So the next stage is action. And stage number 4, action. This is when they've decided, okay, I'm suiting up, I'm showing up, I'm going to do the work. And they're committed. And no one is dragging them across the finish line. They themselves want to do this work. And this is a very productive stage to be in. It's easy to coach people that want to get into action
Mhm.
because they do the reading that you ask them to do. They listen to the podcast. They write the journaling. They take the action. They make the changes as they identify them, and they're open to the idea that they may need to discover new ways to change. One change can lead to another change. So they build momentum in this stage. Um, Now, then the last stage is maintenance. So once somebody, especially if they've left drugs or alcohol or left some kind of abusive behavior or left something that has been dysfunctional in their life or have improved things that used to be dysfunctional, but now they have new behaviors, new thoughts, new tech, strategies. So maintenance is the stage where they want to just keep doing the right thing and not backslide into the former and previous behaviors that were, dysfunctional. And none of these are totally linear. I mean, people can bounce around in these phases, but they're generally progressive so that you really can't get to maintenance until you've really gotten through action because then there's
Mhm.
something to maintain. So those are the stages for the stages of change. How they apply to people that are neurodiverse and or neurotypical or in a relationship with neurodiversity is that sometimes it's one partner that clues into something's up here in this relationship. Something's out of alignment, something isn't working. And maybe it tends to be the neurotypical partner sometimes who is struggling to find an answer. Why isn't our marriage counseling working? What's going on here? And they do some research and they'll read a few articles and they're the ones who come up with, oh my gosh, I think my spouse is neurodiverse. This
Right.
is maybe where we're at. And maybe there is or isn't a diagnosis, but at that point, there is the idea that, wow, we're dealing with something we didn't know what it is. We have to learn about this. What are we going to do about this? How does this, what opportunities do we have? What does this mean for our marriage? And one of them at least gets into action or, begins to go forward. And sometimes both of them are very motivated equally to, enter coaching or counseling, to read, to learn about it. Many of the people I work with are fairly well read coming to my first meeting. They've read some books, they've listened to your podcast, Mona.
Yeah.
you know, they're knowledgeable. They just haven't figured out what is my opportunity? What do I have to change? Right.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's important because there are times when one of the partners is totally in denial that this is a real thing. I'm not on the spectrum. I don't have autism. That's a 4-letter word to them. They don't want to consider what that might mean in terms of strengths, even.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with them. Uh, their partner is just nagging, complaining, overly sensitive, illogical, emotional.
Mhm.
And they're dismissive. And so that would put them in the pre contemplation stage that they're just not even ready to engage.
Mhm.
Um, when somebody's in the contemplation stage, then the second one, you can begin to give them reasons that they should engage, and they can still choose not to. But they're closer to moving into preparation and action when they're at least in contemplation. It's the ones that are in total denial and I don't want to hear it and there's nothing wrong with me that they're not coachable. They don't
Yeah.
really want to learn anything or take any responsibility. So those are how the stages might apply to couples that I'm working with.
I think that this is going to be, so important for probably a lot of the non-autistic neurotypical partners to hear, because I think something that can be, so frustrating is when you read all the books or all the articles and watch the videos and listen to the podcasts and you are, 99.9% sure that you're in a neurodiverse relationship and there's literally total denial on your partner's side, it can be emotionally depressing.
Mhm.
It can be anxiety producing, and it can be a real challenge. And, I repeatedly tell folks who are in my support group, you can't change your partner
Right.
ever, 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 ever. Knowing the stages of change is important, but you can't change your partner. You can only change yourself.
Mm.
And as you're changing, your partner may change, but if not, it's an opportunity for you to reevaluate whether this is the relationship you want to be in,
Right.
because there's no guarantee that anything will change on your partner's side.
Exactly.
So I love that there's more resources out there, Barbara, and I love the way you explained the different stages and how they could apply to a couple. And I know, I'm sure when people come either calling you or talking to you and come actually for coaching or counseling, you see all different kinds of presentations. And what I mean by that is, the typical person, the Big Bang Theory is not the only presentation for somebody who's autistic.
Mm.
It is a spectrum. So you're going to find, just as you would with a non-autistic or a neurotypical person, there's artists, there's musicians, there's engineers, there's finance folks, and everything in between.
Mhm.
So can you share a little bit about maybe what you're seeing as you're working with folks, so that some of the other therapists and coaches that are listening might even have a light bulb go off in their head and say, oh,
Yeah.
maybe that's why things weren't working for
Yeah.
that couple.
No, I really appreciate this question. And I have to say that the art of assessing people that are autistic is really nascent. It's very much in its nativity. It hasn't been very, very well established, and it is not a consistent process throughout the United States by any means. There
Yes.
is, you know, different clinicians can come up with all kinds of different takes on things and using different tools. So that's very unfortunate. Hopefully that will continue to evolve and change as different people in the space speak into that. um, I The way I see it, and the idea of a spectrum. So I always think of the spectrum of light, and we think of spectrums as being maybe linear, like one end versus the other end. And early in this work, I realized, you know what? It's not a spectrum. It's really a three-dimensional, it's got three-axis graph. It's an
Mm,
XY axis graph. And that the traits that can present it's a constellation of traits. All right.
I love that. I love it.
And
Constellation of traits.
and
Yeah.
that kind of thinking has led me to think about things like, well, an example you and I talked about before, snowflakes. So water freezes along the same principles all the time, right? It
Right.
crystallizes, but even though it's a hexagonal crystallization process, there are no two snowflakes that are alike.
Absolutely.
So, even though some basic neurological principles and truths physiologically and whatever are in place, how it all presents and manifests can be very, very different. And it can be so much influenced as well by the family of origin experience.
Hmm.
So, if someone was raised in a very chill, happy, connected, warm family of origin where everyone was honored and nobody was put down and everyone was accepted and enjoyed for who they were, that tends to breed a very securely attached person, who means they have a sense of themselves that's secure. They're not always doubting themselves. They're not always trying to please somebody else. They're not traumatized.
Hmm.
And so,
Or in a place of guilt and shame, which I hear a
yeah,
lot from
yes,
autistic partners, and
yeah,
that's very difficult to
yes,
get through that. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
So, a family of origin experience very much influences, I think, how autism can manifest, and the coping skills that an individual can have, or the additional trauma that they have to deal with. Because I think many neurodiverse people are somewhat traumatized. Their sensory perception is very acute. Um, their way of thinking isn't necessarily in tune with the neurotypical world they're living in. And there's always a little bump and abrasion that they're experiencing on a day-to-day level where they're trying to process and understand, or their way of processing and communicating and understanding doesn't work for their playmates at school or their teachers or even their family. So there's a lot of trauma that happens for neurodiverse people. Their personalities are all different. And some are incredibly social. They love people. They love to talk. They're outward. They're funny, you know. And I want to say up front, eye contact has very little to do with assessing somebody on the spectrum, because a lot of people figure out how to appear to have eye contact, or they in fact can have eye contact. It's not a way that you can say, oh, well, he does eye contact, he can't have autism, or she does eye contact. Women especially on the spectrum are incredibly adept at masking, and are often never suspected. And it tends to be the secondary symptoms, I call them secondary symptoms, of anxiety and depression that will present to clinicians and as a problem. That's what happened in my first husband's life, as well as my son's life. They were diagnosed as being depressed and anxious. Nobody picked up the autism. Psychiatrists, child psychologists, nobody picked it up.
Can we talk about that and just pause for a second? Because I think this is a really important point that I haven't really talked with any of my guests about.
Okay.
And I think that what you're saying is, again, going to resonate with a lot of folks. And not only may there be anxiety and depression in the autistic person who isn't formally identifying as autistic or hasn't self-diagnosed or received a formal diagnosis, but there's also anxiety and depression in the non-autistic partner when they're in a relationship, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and not saying that anxiety and depression isn't necessarily due to neurodivergency, because it could be, but I think when we don't know about our different neurology, we don't understand that our brains are not just wired differently, but we literally have very different operating systems, that when you're trying on both sides, and I hear this from both partners, and I'm guessing you do too, everything I say, everything I do is not enough with, and I'm just going to say, in my case, my ex used to say that to me: no matter what I do, no matter what I say, no matter how many times I do this right, you always find something that I haven't done up to your standards, or I haven't done it quite right. I'm never going to be able to meet your expectations. I mean, he would say that often. How depressing and how anxiety producing is that? And I know from conversations after 32 years that, he often felt different. And, if he couldn't have a safe space in our marriage because we didn't know how to work through some of these challenges, that's going to create depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
Plus the trauma and whatever bullying he had when he was younger. And I hear this over and over again from neurodiverse folks. And then for the partner who's not autistic and is trying to figure things out and doesn't know, or even does know, the anxiety of maybe not having the emotional reciprocity they want and desire, or having the physical and sexual intimacy that they might have had at the beginning of the relationship has waned, or there's some kind of addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs, or something's going on. And then they're feeling distant from their partner. And then, the anxiety and the depression kind of come together because, you lose hope. You wonder what you're doing wrong. Both partners may think they're crazy.
Right.
And it's just a spiral. And that's why I think doing the podcast, having information available for folks, making folks aware of counselors and coaches who are really trained to work with neurodiverse couples is so critical, because you don't have to do this alone, right?
No. Well, hopefully not. Hopefully there's always going to be somebody with space on their calendar. We fill up sometimes, and it's so sad to not be able to take everybody that needs help, because we can't turn out qualified coaches and therapists fast enough in this arena, is
I agree.
what I believe. So, but the emphasis has to be on qualified.
I agree. I agree. So do you want to talk any more about the anxiety and depression before you talk more about, different presentations and other things that you've seen? Or
Well, yeah, we can, that actually, I like what you brought up about trauma, because I think that even the neurotypical they're going to be depressed. They're going to have autoimmune issues. They're not even going to know, like you said, what is the real problem. Why is there the problem that they're having? And I have a handout I give people when they first come to me. It's called the ABCDEs of couple burnout, and it is a one pager that basically explains, what autism burnout is. So autistic burnout can happen to anyone on the spectrum who doesn't know how to pace themselves in their life.
mm-hmm.
They're just taking on too much. They don't understand that their sensitivities are greater, that their thresholds are lower sometimes. And they, head into marriage, they head into relationships, they head into parenting, they head into very complex careers, and they don't necessarily do the math on, can I handle all of this? Right.
Right.
And,
Right.
I had one client who had like a cyclical every 3 years. They hit burnout and depression. And it was only when we looked at the fact that, well, let's look at what you were doing in those 3 years. Oh, you were always like maxing it out. You were in med school or you were in residency. And of course you were like, that would put anybody to the limit. In your case, it was over your limit and you burned
Right.
out. Right. So
Right.
that was a big aha for, for some people. They go, wow, there's such a thing as autism burnout. I didn't know that. And that explains a lot to them.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side of the equation, a neurotypical who's married or in close relationship with someone who is neurodiverse, and there's this subtle undercurrent of craziness for both of them, but particularly the relational disappointments or frustrations that the neurotypical is having, they get traumatized, and it's long-term affective deprivation disorder. It is very much sometimes like what can happen to people that they're in a, well, it's an analogy. This is not to say that we're prisoners of war as neurotypicals, but when you're a prisoner of war over a long period of time, your neurology is sorely affected. You're traumatized by the constant crazy, limitations of imprisonment and not knowing what's coming and being, mistreated, or what you would consider to be mistreated. So
Right.
neurotypicals have a cumulative experience of trauma, that there's no one thing. It's like death by 10,000 paper cuts kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is very real. And again, it can be compounded by their family of origin story. Many of us, I was in a very difficult, I had a lot of trauma growing up. My mom was PTSD coming out of it
Mm-hmm.
too. And, nobody knew what it was. Nobody
Right.
had that figured out. But I was on the receiving end with my sisters of a lot of stuff that was very, very confusing and traumatizing. And that probably had me desensitized in some ways to picking up what may or may not be helpful relational dysfunction. And I've had many relationships even prior to my marriage that were not successful,
Mm-hmm.
that were, dysfunctional, I would even call them. And I was dysfunctional. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to own that. I was very not healthy in how I related or how I dealt with stress or anger or frustration. I totally own that. I hope I've grown and healed in many ways, but, I was not as understanding of who I was coming into my marriage, or in some of the relationships I engaged in, as I hope to be, as I think I am now. And that's
Mm-hmm.
true for many neurotypicals, and the trauma that they experience compounds that. So I think, because there are no two people alike on the spectrum, and there are no two neurotypicals who are alike, the art of understanding the customers, the clients, when they come in, and what their goals are, what their particular issues and presentation is it's case by case. And I'm sure you have that experience too, Mona.
Absolutely. And I want to say that one of the things that I felt was important to do was to start neurodiverse couples support groups. And I just started them, 2 months ago. And I had not been in one during my marriage. And I thought, okay, we'll try this. And what I will tell you, Barbara, and I don't know if you do groups for couples, is that it has been so enlightening for every single couple that has started or has finished the group. And they say things like, we know no other couples that are like us. It
Mm,
is so amazing to hear our story be told by somebody else who we've never met.
hmm.
They must be a fly on our wall.
Yeah.
And I mean, I almost want to cry when I hear these things, because what's happening is people are feeling like they're not feeling, they are being validated. Both of their perspectives are accurate and correct, but they have to understand, they have to build that bridge. They have to understand that change is going to take longer for their autistic partners than it is for, the non-autistic or neurotypical partner. And there's a lot of work that's been done by the non-autistic or neurotypical partner to learn about neurodiversity. And so there's going to be like catch up, and there's so much patience and grace and compassion that has to be given to each partner.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to
Yeah.
start practicing new ways of communicating and new ways of listening and new ways of hearing and new ways of, thinking about date nights and, sensory sensitivities and everything. So not only do folks who come into therapy or coaching all present very differently, every couple, but where they are
Hmm.
in understanding what's going on for themselves individually and in their relationship
Yeah.
is at very, very different places.
Yeah. No,
Right.
exactly right. In
Yeah.
fact, I kind of created more for myself initially. I had to map this out. I'm like, okay, where are people coming in from, and what do they need to go, and what are the stages? And I ended up creating a roadmap to couples coaching, which I give to clients as I onboard them. Um, so I'll just go through that a little bit if that's okay, because I think it really
Absolutely.
does identify and address some of the things we're talking about. So I tell couples when they come in that they've been in a three-legged race. Marriage is a three-legged race, and I don't know if you've ever, Mona, done a three-legged race. I've done it a few times, and as an adult, once our church did a sort of a sports day, and I remember the experience of being bound to another adult who was different height. My girlfriend, she was totally different height and body style than me, and we were trying to hustle down the sports field with one leg, our ties.
Right.
Oh my gosh, it was the most hysterical thing.
Yeah. But you didn't have to do it every day for the rest of your life. So,
No, but we couldn't even do it for 10 feet without falling down.
right. I love
It
it.
was
I love it.
it was very convicting. Like, unless you really are paying attention to the gait and stride of the other, and both of you working to kind of meet that middle ground. Somebody's going into the mud, and the other
Right.
one's going down right after them. So
Right.
after years of trying to walk together, these couples, their third leg, their marriage leg, is kind of busted up, bruised, and traumatized. And I tell people, if you've had a broken leg, or even a sprained ankle, you're not supposed to put weight on that limb or ankle.
Right.
You're supposed to elevate it. Maybe it goes into a cast, you immobilize it, you give it space, you give it grace, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And
To heal.
you to heal, to de-traumatize. And even when it comes out of the cast after 8 weeks or 12 weeks, you got, there's PT. You're not running a marathon
Right.
anytime soon.
Right.
So I talk about that as a metaphor for the couples to begin to understand this is not a time that you are equipped or ready to really tackle big problems in your life, big conversations. You need to kind of cut each other some slack. Everybody needs to get into their lane, learn what their lane is, and understand what their area of opportunity and growth is. So phase one, or the first stage, of the roadmap here is about educating and getting their paradigms to shift from what they thought they were involved with to the reality of what they are involved with.
Right.
And learning about neurodiversity, learning about their neurotypical behaviors, learning about each other's. And for the spouse that's neurodiverse, it is about accepting it, coming to terms with it in order to be able to engage with coaching. For the neurotypical, it's the beginning of a grieving process often, where I find that unless a neurotypical is able to access their deep sorrow about loss of what they had thought they were involved with, they'll stay in anger, rage, bitterness, resentment, and fear, and they won't cry. They won't have the, cleansing and neurologically beneficial experience of sobbing out, what has happened, and making time for that. And then we begin to talk a lot about self-care, which is true for any traumatized person. They need to be invited to prioritize their own self-care, whatever that means for them, and to learn that they have to, take responsibility for their behaviors. Like self-control is their opportunity. The world is not going to turn into a perfect place where they'll never be triggered again. They're going to have to learn mindfulness or other things to, fortify their ability to self-regulate, both neurotypical and neurodiverse person. Sometimes the neurodiverse has more of a challenge with this because they have less connection to mind, body, understanding of that. But those are opportunities in the first. And also we begin to talk about boundaries, and the healthy relationship has protective boundaries, not punitive boundaries. Boundaries are about setting limits and communicating those limits. Just like when you get a speeding ticket, the speed limit on the freeway is a boundary. When I go 10 miles above that speed limit, I'm taking the risk of getting a ticket. But the only reason I pay attention to the boundary is because there's going to be a consequence. And a lot of people set boundaries in their mind, but they never communicate them. They don't post their limits. And they also don't post what the fine or violation or consequence, is. Like, if you yell at me again, I'm going to get up and leave the room. I'm not going to be talked to that way. That's a consequence, right? But that's a clearly communicated boundary. So we work with boundaries a lot. And so stage 2, the next stage, is about equipping. Now that people have their orientation and understand what they're really dealing with and are setting their own goals for change, we can begin to work together. I start usually with couples separately. I work with them individually to get to know them very well, each of them. And they each have different things they need to learn. And they each have different stories they need to be validated in, right? And they're not in a position to, share certain things with their spouse present. So it's very constructive to meet individually with them. In time, then, we're ready to start doing joint sessions and talking about some of the joint goals and learning about what does or doesn't work in terms of communication. And yourself, that sometimes it's better to send a text or an email than to blurt something out at the dinner table and expect a response right away. Timing is everything. And then I work with a structured dialogue that I'll talk about a little bit more at the end. It's called active listening. We'll spend a little more time on that at the end. But I get into some of the tools that Grace teaches about, like the 3 R's of apology and perspective taking, things like that, where they can begin to have some handles on things. I find that as couples get the hang of this and are beginning to engage and solve small problems with the active listening, that they are beginning to reprioritize and each of them heal in their own way. This is when it goes very well, that there's mutual healing and calming down, and they begin to not cross over from their lane into the others. There's not as much controlling or bickering or criticizing. There's a lot more acceptance. And it turns into them having the ability to have compassion for the other, more compassion, where they begin to understand that they may have been a cause without intention, and they want to resolve that, and they want to do better if they can. and a resetting of expectations. And at this level, problem resolution can become much more complex versus, how do we balance a checkbook to let's talk about, our intimate life, our sexual life, and people can have conversations when they have the experience of, okay, I know what we're dealing with. I know that I'm going to be supported in this. I know I'm going to be validated, and I know I'm going to be heard, maybe not understood, but hearing each other and feeling heard is a big part of communication.
Yes.
Right.
That's so critical.
So I'll talk now. Wait, I want to give you a chance to comment on anything I'm saying because I can go on for hours, as you know.
No, I want you to go through all of this. I'm taking some notes because I do want to stress a few of the things that you've said, but I'd love for you to just finish this roadmap because I think it's going to be, again, so helpful to so many listeners.
Excellent. Okay, great. So that third phase I call the effective phase, where you're becoming effective in what you're doing. So first was educate, then was equip, then there's effective, and the next one is about endure, learning to maintain. Would be equivalent to the maintenance stage of the stages of change, where you're really making the best of the marriage. You're looking at the glass half full rather than half empty. That there's been an increase in trust. You're building trust. I look at trust as a credit card or a credit balance. When we get these 3 credit bureaus that assess our credit.
Yeah.
If we've been paying our bills on time and we have fairly high credit scores. But over a period of time, if you're delinquent and missing payments and owing money and faulting on many levels, your credit score is going to go down. And
Right.
even if you pay your bills the next week all on time, well, that's only 1 week of credit worthiness. You've got to be credit worthy for months in order to raise your score back up. And that's the same thing with endure. If you've learned something good, you need to be doing that and not the bad thing for a long period of time for your partner to trust you and have emotional confidence and feel secure in that relationship again. And I try to stress that, to set expectations of how long this can take. Not that they have to be in coaching all the time, but they still have to be showing up in the relationship. And this is more of a check-in with me every month or 3 months, to see how it's going and continue to grow and evolve, not just in the marriage, but in other relationships in their lives, or getting healed with children. There's a lot of opportunity for growth once a couple understands what the dynamic was and what needs to change. The last then stage of this would be to energize. And I'm very big on the idea that I think AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, really was based on the principle of when somebody makes a breakthrough towards sobriety, you want to go share that and find somebody else that you can help make the same breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And that is a very wonderful principle in life, because whenever we have a mess, we can overcome our mess, and our fixed mess can become a message to somebody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not that we need to tell people what to do, but if we're willing to share how we've overcome our problems and our particular problem of neurodiversity in marriage, there's so many people out there that have this problem that until they hear somebody talking about it, they don't even know that that's their problem too.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
So if we're willing to share what we're doing and how we're growing and learning, and then we're willing to share a book or share an article or say, let me send you Mona's podcast,
with Barbara Grant as a guest on the podcast.
Yeah. So, we're then becoming part of the solution, not just for ourselves, but for others. And we can become encouragers and even mentors when we really get the hang of this and just help others. I think in helping others, we really even help ourselves more, because we relearn every lesson that we're trying to teach to somebody else.
Amen.
And, some of us might be calling Grace and getting into her AANE neurodiverse coaching program.
Exactly. So Barbara, I again, I say this all the time. When I love something, I love it. And I love your roadmap. And again, I think it's going to be really helpful because it's very concrete for both partners.
Mhm.
And I think I'm going to touch a little bit on each of the pieces, and then I would love for you to go into some of the strategies that you use, like you talked about active
Yeah.
listening.
Okay.
So I think the education piece, again, like you said, that's the first step because one partner might be educating themselves and reading all the books and watching all the videos, and the other partner is in denial or doesn't want to have anything to do with any of the increase in knowledge.
Right.
That is going to create an imbalance, and so I think that's a major thing that is very helpful in helping to begin to shift the paradigm, as you said. And I think that the fact that you work with each um, partner separately, I've heard a lot of other therapists and coaches who do that. And
Mhm.
I think that can be really, really helpful because both are in different places and don't want to be negated. And
Mhm.
I talked about this, I posted something on Instagram about this week about negating. And I realized it was an epiphany for me that over and over again, I negated my ex husband
Mm.
when he was sharing his reality because I wanted his reality to be my reality. And I'll give you an example. So when he would say to me, I'm doing the best that I can, I would say, no, you're not. And I
Mm.
would scream it at him. I mean,
Mhm.
like you said earlier, I've done so much work over the last 5 years that I can laugh about these things. But if I had mentioned this to you 3 years ago, I probably would be crying right now.
Mm.
So I would negate him and I would say, no, you're not, because you were able to do this, this, and this, 5 months ago, 5 years ago, whatever. Well, no, he was doing the best he could on that day, in that moment, and it wasn't enough for me. And so what I was doing, not knowing unintentionally, is I was trying to make him feel guilty and I was shaming him for not having the spoons, not having the capacity, not having the bandwidth,
Mhm.
whatever, right?
Mhm.
And I think that goes on a lot in relationships, period, but especially in neurodiverse relationships when we don't have that education and we don't understand each other
Right.
and we don't have the tools to speak to each other in a way that we can be heard, hopefully understood, but definitely heard and heard with compassion.
Right.
So I think that the education, the equipping pieces are so important. And then the endure piece, I think, my gosh, I can't tell you how many folks, when they're given certain tools, and I'm sure you see this, and they see that there's a change in the way the emotional reciprocity is given, the way the communication occurs, that conflict is reduced, then they begin to have trust in each other and in their relationship again. And
Mhm.
they realize, yeah, I can stay in this relationship. Or I trust that this is not something that's going to change and this isn't the right relationship for me, right? And then to be energized whether you stay or you go, because going doesn't mean you're a failure.
Right.
Hopefully going means that you understand there are limits for both of you in this relationship and the limits are things that one or both of you can't accept, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fine. But instead of leaving traumatized or so angry and so bitter that one or both of you is suffering, how about getting through this roadmap and understanding that this is the way it is and I'm ready to move on? Or I am 100% committed and I'm in this relationship for the rest of my life and I understand things I never did. So I did a little
Mhm.
summary of all these things that you talked about in at length, but I love, love, love the roadmap.
Mhm. Well, I
So
love what you're sharing too at the end there. So something that I'm training in currently and will be much more involved with in my practice is what's called discernment counseling. And
mhm,
discernment counseling is done on the front end, like meeting number one. You try to figure out not only how are they interested in growing and changing, but is somebody in or out of this marriage already in their mind? And that makes a difference because traditional couples counseling is based on the premise that both people want to make the relationship work and know enough about what's going on to make that decision, when in fact coming in, the couple doesn't know anything. They're
Right.
barely and they don't even know if they want to stay in the marriage. And to make that an okay position right from the start, like they need to know they can choose whatever is best. You just want to help them make choices in a healthy and good way.
Yeah.
And that's what coaching is about, is like, let's get you to the place of understanding where if you are going to choose to leave the marriage or end the relationship, do that from a place of knowledge and clarity, versus being a pinball bouncing all around, in a machine and then banging out of this relationship into another one and taking the same problems and lack of clarity with you.
Yeah, I'm raising both hands. I have collected the t-shirts and I'm singing hallelujah under my breath to what you just said. I think discernment counseling or coaching, I don't know how long it's been around, but it will be a godsend to, I'm sure, most couples that go through it, but especially neurodiverse couples, because I will tell you, Barbara, and I've said it over and over again on the podcast, both my ex and I still loved each other. We sat at the courthouse before we went in to file our divorce papers, talking about how much we still loved each other. And, it doesn't break my heart anymore. But, when I thought about it afterwards, I'm like, I don't think either one of us really wanted a divorce. But, we needed to go down our separate paths to heal, and we didn't have a therapist or a coach that we both felt comfortable with at the time. And we only knew for about 9 months when we filed for divorce. And I think there's so many couples that end up like that. And people will say to me, I still love him, or I still love her, or I'm still in love. How can it be so hard? How do I let go? How do I move on when I'm still in love? And that, I think, is really hard. And the discernment coaching and counseling can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, I'm glad you're going to be doing that. So the last thing I want to talk about is the active listening and any other tools that you want to share. And then I'd love for you to give folks your contact information so they can reach out to you.
Oh, okay, great. Well, the active listening is something I certainly didn't invent. And I've found a few videos and handouts that I've embellished and worked with to kind of help my clients understand the whole point of what we're doing. So I liken it to playing a game of catch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So I throw like a girl. What can I say? But if I were playing with somebody who was like an all-star pitcher, for the Yankees, and we're playing catch, they would probably not be throwing me, a 110-mile-an-hour ball with heat to play catch with me. They're going to throw me a catchable ball.
Right.
I, in turn, after catching it, would do my best to throw them a catchable ball as well, not 10 feet wide of where they're standing, but to them at a pace that they could catch it. And when we're playing with kids, when we're doing this with kids, we are very clear of their ability to throw, and we stand close to them and we throw them a very gentle ball, and we're looking to back and forth that. So communication is not just what we say or what we hear, but it's predominantly what we understand, what is caught, right? And so when couples, I find, are struggling with their relationship, what has often been at root problem is an inability to communicate.
Yep.
One person knows what they're thinking, knows what they're feeling, they say something, and the other person doesn't hear it for what is meant. They hear it the way they are spinning it, and they are now reacting to what they think was said, but not in fact what was meant. So and then it goes sideways like almost immediately. Right? So active listening is a process where the speaker has the floor. Whoever is the speaker, they have the floor, and they say clearly and succinctly in 3 or no more than 3 sentences what they are meaning and wanting to talk about. The other person, the listener, their job, they're only allowed to mirror back or paraphrase back what they think they heard. If it was correct, and they say, did I get that right? The speaker can say, that's exactly right. And now they can add more to that. if it wasn't right, the speaker can go, you know what? That's close, but that's not exactly it. This is more what I meant to say. And they can go back and forth until they actually have honed the actual meaning of what is being communicated. So that's the idea. How I use this in coaching is that as an initial communications exercise, I ask each party in the couple to come up with a simple problem they would like to solve. So one couple came up with this. Her thing was she wanted to build out a closet that they had. They had an old closet, and she wanted to get shelving in there and compartments and new hanging.
Mm-hmm.
And she had her reasons. And um, I think her husband's issue was that he felt he wanted to go on more dates, but they never had babysitters that they could call. And he was frustrated about that. So the method is this, and I have to say the neurodiverse people love this because it's rules based, and they love
it. Right.
And they also love it because their spouse won't go on and on and on for 10 minutes talking at them. They can only speak in 3 sentences.
Right.
So there's four parts of this. The first part is the speaker has to say what they think the problem is. Then after it's back and forth, they got that right. Then the speaker says what their feelings about the problem are. All right. Yep. So we get emotions in there.
Yep.
All right. And the listener is not necessarily validating, but is mirroring and correctly receiving what is being said. The third part is the speaker has to bring some ideas for possible solutions. All right.
Which is so important.
Right.
Which is so important because we can complain and bitch about everything that's wrong with our partners and the situation in our relationship. And I'm again raising 2 hands, but if we don't have any ways to address it or any possible solutions, we're just nagging.
Right. We're just bitching, right? Exactly. Right. So they get to say their ideas for solutions, and of course that's mirrored back. And then if there is a time frame involved, I'd like to do this next week, next month, within the next year, they get to say their time frame. And all this time, the speaker has been speaking to all 4 points, and the listener has been listening and mirroring. The next round is to flip it. So the same problem or topic, but now the listener becomes the speaker. Mm-hmm. And they get to say what they think about the problem. And if it's a different slant on the problem or a bigger scope than was outlined before, they get to say how they feel about it, what their ideas for solutions are, and what their time frame is. So what I love about this process, Mona, is that it puts all of the building blocks of solutions on the table. Mm-hmm. What is the problem? How do we feel about it? What is our time frame? What do we think the solutions are? And almost invariably, when the couple has done round 1 and round 2, where everybody's shared and everybody's been heard, they can they can solve the problem immediately. They go, well, we should do this. And I think you're right about that. You're right about the time frame. And you feel this way. So, and they put a solution together right away.
It's so amazing, isn't it? It's such a simple technique. Sometimes active listening or reflective listening or mirroring. I know it's called all different things, but it can really be a game changer.
It is. And so after 3 or 4 times of doing this, where each of them have brought different problems of increasing levels of complexity, mm-hmm. and I say, guys, I want you to be practicing this at home. If you have to talk about something, you need to do active listening. If you go sideways in a communication, go to active listening. You can do this at home. But what it does for the most part is it builds a confidence in them that they can say what they mean, they can be heard, they can be understood, they can understand each other, and they can solve problems. And with that confidence, I have seen couples do amazing things, have amazing conversations in session, end up hugging each other, deeply compassionate and caring for one another, simply because they learned how to speak to one another without disrupting each other or misunderstanding each other or reacting. it's such I want to cry when I see it.
I
so
I
encouraging.
hear you, and I think sometimes thank you so much for explaining that so beautifully. And I think sometimes people don't trust that they can have a compassionate, calm, civilized conversation after so many years of unintentional hurt, pain, and trauma. And so the only thing that I guess I would put out to the listeners is, and I found this after my divorce, is preparing, your partner for the active listening
Mhm.
and saying, can we have a conversation about, let's say, the closet that wants to be remodeled, or they want to remodel, when would be a good time for you? Because I know, I was the person who always wanted to have those conversations the second my ex walked through the door after work.
Mm. Yeah,
Wrong time.
yeah,
He needed his time to decompress, and I don't think either one of us knew exactly what was needed, and or while we're lying down at 11:30 at night. Wrong time for
mhm.
us, so you got to understand, what the best time is to have those conversations.
Right.
And Barbara, I know it can be a humongous game changer. So thank you. I think that's going to be very easy for folks to follow too. So we're at the end, and I'm sure we could talk for another 5 hours. But I'm wondering if there's anything else that you haven't shared that you might want to share. And then if you would share your contact information and whether or not you have a wait list, and what kind of resources you provide.
The thing I want to share is that a lot of the people that I've met with have come out of other therapeutic relationships, or some of them are still in therapy on some level with somebody. And I just want to invite your listening audience to really be advocates into the therapeutic world for education about neurodiversity.
Mm.
All right.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
That,
Amen. Amen.
it
Yeah.
needs to be the clients. I have to tell you, demand drives supply. And so if clients were more um, vocal about, we would like you to get trained in this. We want to work with you, but you're not trained in this. We want to get you, trained in this. Or even to be knowledgeable about some of the resources that are out there, like AANE. And
Hmm.
Dr. Stephanie Holmes has also got a lot of training that she has up for anybody who wants it. Amazing training. And she also reaches out to clergy and churches and organizations. So there's all kinds of movements of training happening there. But unless a therapist or a clinician understands that their deficit in this arena can be significantly damaging to their clients. Um,
Yes.
they aren't going to necessarily take that training or educate themselves. So that's the only thing I wanted to say. And as far as contacting me, is that the next part you wanted me to
Yep.
say? Okay.
Yep.
So I have a website. It's www.bg-hc.com. And that is short for Barbara Grant Hope for Couples.
I
So
love it.
bg-hc.com. And I also, if anyone wants to contact me for a free 25-minute session, they can fill out a form at a different website. They can also find it on my regular website, but the other website is www.hopeforcouples.net.
Okay. Wonderful. And I have to thank you so much. I mean, this episode is rich with so much valuable information and insight and tools. And I just want to add to what you said about therapists and
Hmm.
coaches and counselors, because I literally called the three therapists that my ex and I had worked with during our separation once I found out that we were a neurodiverse couple. And I asked them if they had any training or if they knew anything about neurodiversity. All three of them said no.
Mhm.
I asked them if they knew anybody in the area who had experience in this, and they said no. And I was, a little traumatized at the time, but I was going to send them Maxine Aston's book, The Autistic Couples Workbook, which is phenomenal and I love, but I never got around to it.
Yeah.
And I do think, and I've talked about this on the podcast, those 3 therapists did not mean any harm. They
No.
absolutely did not mean any harm. But I walked out of those 3 counseling experiences more traumatized, more depressed, more anxious, more hurt, because they gave my ex the freedom to say whatever,
Mm,
and he was more hurtful during those counseling sessions than he had ever been during our relationship. And
mm,
I've heard that over and over again from couples, but also there was no validation. In fact,
yeah.
I was considered, emotional, nagging, whatever. And yeah, I've healed, but I think that therapists who see that they're working with couples who are not having the success with the therapeutic model that usually is successful for them with couples, that they need to take a step back and explore neurodiversity
Yeah.
before moving forward, because they can do more harm than good. So that's my soapbox.
Yep.
I'll join you on that one, Barbara. I'll join you on that one. So thank you again so much for your time, for sharing your personal experience, for sharing your expertise. And I am sure that a lot of folks in our audience, our listeners, are going to reach out. You don't have a waiting list. You are.
Well, I'm beginning to form one actually as we speak. Yeah, it's probably something that I'm going to have to start putting in place. I haven't had one, and I will try always to do a free 25-minute appointment. I will always try for that. But whether or not I can onboard somebody or a couple, I want to, of course, be fair to the couple and not, shortchange them, or if I have to space sessions too far apart and we lose momentum. So I have to be wise as well. But I'm still open for 25-minute freebies, and as people drop off, I am onboarding new ones. So give me a holler. Let's see what can happen.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you. You have a wonderful, wonderful day. And I so appreciate all you're doing to help neurodiverse couples out there in the world. Thank you,
Thanks.
Barbara.
Thanks, Nona.
All right. Take care.
Bye bye.